All right, so first off, obviously, happy Thanksgiving to everybody out there. I took about 5 days off of the channel, which is probably the longest break that I've had in about a year and a half on this channel. And so it's good to be back. Obviously, I missed a lot, but I hope you all had a good time. I hope you guys got maybe a little bit time off of work and got to eat some good food. So with that being said, let's just go ahead and get into it here. So I got a lot to catch up on. First off, there was a hostage deal that was met between Israel and Hamas. It was negotiated in Qatar, and basically you had a bunch of Israeli hostages that were taken on October 7th during that Hamas offensive into southern Israel, and they were swapped for Palestinian hostages who in large part were taken from the West Bank. And I do make a specific point to call the Palestinians on this side hostages, because that is effectively what they are. Now we're going to circle back around to a little bit more information on that here in a second, but basically the gist of it is that Israel likes to do raids and make arrests in the West Bank, which is essentially, as Mike Preisner, who I talked to last week, characterized it as basically a military dictatorship in the West Bank under Israeli control. And they like to go in, they do raids, they make arrests of, in many cases, just random Palestinians, or maybe it was some Palestinian kid who had a rock in their hand or something like that, and they hold them under what they call indefinite detention or administrative detention, and they are held without charge in many instances. They are held without ever getting to see any legitimate due process or a fair trial or anything like that. They are subjected to military courts, and so I don't just use that term to make any sort of like false equivalence here. I think it's very fair to call these Palestinian hostages and Israeli hostages, and it looks like there was some sort of a deal that was worked out to do a swap here. Now, you had, I think, more Palestinians who were released for Israelis. I think the ratio is roughly like 3-to-1 in terms of Palestinians who were released versus Israelis who were released. And as a part of this deal, you had basically a 4-day pause that was put in place. And this pause, apparently, based on what I've read, can be extended sort of on a day-by-day basis. If more hostages in Gaza are released, then Israel will, I guess, hold off on some of the bombing temporarily, right? So that's basically the gist of the hostage deal that was reached. And this was called a ceasefire for some reason by a lot of people. It wasn't ever really a ceasefire. It was sort of more like a pause or a sort of letting up of some of the bombing that was happening in Gaza. And of course, as pointed out here by Joshua P. Hill, he says during this so-called ceasefire in Gaza, Israel has attacked the West Bank, Lebanon, and now Syria as well. So I don't think you could really call this a ceasefire by any stretch of the imagination. Now, again, as pointed out here by Hassan Abi, he gives us a little bit of a perspective in terms of the hostages on the Palestinian side. He says it's a good time to remind people that Israel doubled its hostages under indefinite detention, where the conditions are gruesome, and immediately after October 7th, these are mostly civilians who are arrested over secret evidence and held under openly torturous conditions by an occupying force. So again, that's kind of why I call the Palestinians on this side hostages instead of referring to them as prisoners, because I don't think you can really be called a prisoner if you're not actually charged with anything. You are not given due process. You, in many instances, are not given a lawyer. You are subjected to a military court that has a conviction rate of like 99 to 100%. So again, that's why I use that kind of a language. Now, I also wanted to mention this Haaretz reporting here by Shiren Falah Saab, who was basically giving us a perspective in terms of some of the Gazans who are facing a pretty bleak reality on the ground, even amid what you would think would maybe be some good news in the short term of, oh, okay, we have a pause that is in effect, so maybe the bombing is going to let up a little bit. Well, as they lay out here, it's still a pretty bleak reality in Gaza, and I'm going to touch on some of the latest statistics that we have in terms of the humanitarian crisis on the ground. But they say here, temporary ceasefire offers little relief for Gazans facing a new reality. So they got some quotes here from people who are on the ground. They say, life doesn't go back to normal during a ceasefire. Only now do we realize the extent of the destruction, said Isra, an English teacher from Gaza, in an interview with Haaretz. Isra got married last summer and moved to Beit Lahia in the northern part of the Gaza Strip, which at this point is completely uninhabitable. It's unlivable. It has been flattened to the ground. There is no real infrastructure that is left. A vast majority of the the residential buildings, the buildings in general have been destroyed. You know, you have a majority of hospitals at this point that are out of function. So, I mean, the northern portion of the Gaza Strip, which is where Israel told people to flee to the south, which they're still bombing the south anyways, but the northern portion of the Gaza Strip is, and this isn't really my opinion, this is according to the United Nations, is at this point unlivable. And so that's where they're talking about here. So she moved there recently last summer, and she said, quote, and this is really bleak here, "I wish that there was no ceasefire." And her words reflect the frustration and heavy loss that she experienced on the first day of the temporary truce. And she says, like many Gazans, she emerged from hiding to find a new reality of destruction already by the early morning hours of Friday, which is when this pause started. She and her husband left this area where they had been staying since the war began and moved north. And so essentially, when she says, like, "I wish there were no ceasefire," what she's saying essentially is that the ceasefire for a lot of people in Gaza is really an opportunity to go and try to search through the rubble and potentially find your friends, your family, your loved ones, and, coming to the realization that your home, the place that you lived, the place that you wanted to live, and start a family or start your life, has been utterly destroyed, and that there are still bodies under the rubble that need to be recovered at this point. And so that's kind of why she was giving that take there. And they continue, they say, asked why they decided to return to the northern strip during this pause, she replied, "I wanted to see what remained of the house in which I had dreamed that I would begin my new life. Everything was in ruins. We took some personal effects and just a few clothes. There was not a living soul around. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out." They say Ahmed, who is Israel's husband, added that the streets of Beit Lahia were in ruins, making them impassable to cars. The damage to the infrastructure is incomprehensible. It's everywhere. It's impossible to describe. He says that the town's main street, Al-Shaima, suffered great damage due to Israeli tanks that had congregated there, and the newlywed couple who had lived in one of the upscale apartment towers in this area sounded alarm when describing what they witnessed upon returning to northern Gaza, saying, quote, "It's apparently like the aftermath of an earthquake. Nothing remains as it was. What are we guilty of? Israel's problem is with Hamas. Why hurt civilians? Our lives have been destroyed. Our families have been broken. There are no houses left, only stones." So, I mean, again, you can look at images like this. I've seen videos of people on the ground going and doing some more, investigative research or just showing what the destruction looks like on the ground. This pretty much encapsulates it. I mean, obviously it doesn't show the dead bodies and everything that I've seen in some of these videos that are sort of just like strewn around on the street and in houses and under rubble and all of that. But it is as bleak as it can possibly get. And, this makes it even bleaker here, as pointed out by Edinger Mentum. So this was an article that was written about how the Biden administration was viewing some of this humanitarian pause. So obviously the Biden administration hasn't been calling for a ceasefire or anything remotely close to that. They've been sort of like vaguely gesturing towards a humanitarian pause to get some aid into it, as if you're sort of like chucking water bottles at people while you're selling weapons to the people who are dropping bombs on their heads. And this really just takes it to an entirely different level in terms of the complicity and the depravity of the Biden administration. Here's this paragraph here is highlighted. "And there was some concern in the Biden administration about an unintended consequence of the pause, that it would allow journalists broader access to Gaza and the opportunity to further illuminate the devastation there and turn public opinion on Israel." So in other words, they don't give a single solitary shit about the actual Palestinian lives that are being lost. They don't care about the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in Gaza. They care about how journalists getting in during this pause to show the world the destruction and the death and the carnage in Gaza, how that could potentially negatively impact Israel's perception from the global stage, right? Or how that could negatively impact the perception of the Biden administration for supporting this and endorsing this and giving diplomatic cover for this and selling weapons to this. Okay, that's what they're really concerned about. And this also sort of ties in to something I talked about on the channel weeks ago at this point from Anthony Blinken, who was telling Israelis behind the scenes, we want you to do this humanitarian pause, but we don't want to do it for humanitarian reasons. We want you to do it because that will help us in order to justify to the American people a longer offensive, a longer bombing campaign and invasion of Gaza. That's what Anthony Blinken is saying. And it seems like this is being echoed by a lot of people in the Biden administration as well. So I also wanted to show you guys some of the actual latest numbers from on the ground here from Euromed Monitor, and I'm going to give a comparison here to some of the testimony that we've gotten from the IDF on how many Hamas fighters they've killed versus the numbers that we know on the ground of civilians that have been killed and displaced for that matter. So you go here to Euromed Human Rights Monitor. Okay, so their latest death toll here, this is through 24th of November. So even this is a couple days, out of date at this point. They say 20,000 have been killed. 8,000 children. We have now passed the 8,000 dead children mark. Okay, 4,000 women and 18,460 civilians. So you'll notice here, right? 18,460 civilians out of 20,000 killed. Okay, we'll circle back around to that here. 36,000 injuries, 67 killed journalists, and there was also reporting that I'm going to get to here of Israel intentionally targeting journalists. Displaced is now up at 1.73 million people. Keep in mind the population of Gaza is only at like 2.3 million people total, so a vast majority, roughly 75% of the population of Gaza has been internally displaced at this point, and a large part of that is because, as you'll see here from these numbers, the housing in Gaza has been obliterated, right? 60,000 completely destroyed units, 165,000 partially destroyed units, destroyed and damaged press headquarters, 140. 266 damaged schools, 1,000 damaged or destroyed industrial facilities, 91 damaged mosques, 3 damaged churches, 446 targeted health staff, and 124 targeted health facilities. Now, we take that destruction here, and then we're going to compare it to this. Israel's military estimates that it has, and this is from The Guardian here, Israel's military estimates that it has killed between 1,000 and 2,000 Hamas fighters out of a military force that it believes is about 30,000 strong. Okay, and they also point out down here, 40 to 50% of the buildings in northern Gaza have been hit. 1,000 and 2,000, between that, Hamas fighters out of 30,000. Okay, now first off, Israel has not provided any verifiable evidence that they've killed 1,000 to 2,000 Hamas fighters. But let's just put that aside for a second, right? If we take them at face value, let's give them 1,000 Hamas fighters that they've killed. Okay, and I think honestly that's probably higher than the actual reality is. But you've killed 1,000 Hamas fighters roughly to 20,000 total, 18,500 of them being civilians. So if we're doing a real estimate here, we are talking about roughly a ratio of 20 to 1, where you're killing 20 civilians for every one Hamas fighter that you end up killing. And you can do the math on this and extrapolate this out. It's pretty simple math there, right? You take 1,000 fighters that you've killed so far, there's 30,000 total, according to your estimates. You say you want to eradicate Hamas. How many people would you have to kill in order for you to eradicate those 30,000 Hamas fighters based on the ratios that we're seeing right now? And the answer to that is over 600,000. You would have to kill over 600,000 out of a population of 2.3 million, okay, half of whom are children, in order to take out Hamas. And that doesn't even get into, what is actually left of Gaza at that point. Nothing. You would have nothing left that would be habitable at that point in Gaza. Okay, and you also wouldn't have any sort of stability to create a political future for Gaza, or an economic future for Gaza, or a cultural future for Gaza after that kind of an offensive. So that's what we're talking about here. And I think that's important to make clear when Israel comes out and they make simplistic statements like, well, our goal is simply to eradicate Hamas. Well, what does that actually mean? How are you going about doing that? What is the consequence of you doing that? Not just in a political sense in terms of what comes, for Gaza after you eradicate Hamas, but in the meantime, as you're attempting or pretending to attempt to target Hamas fighters, how many civilians are you killing? It would be one thing if you were going out and you were doing these airstrikes and you kill 10 Hamas guys, right? 10 Hamas militants in an airstrike, and you accidentally kill one civilian on the side, right? It wouldn't be good. It would be bad. But it would also be, somewhat more understandable to say, well, look, we're clearly targeting Hamas people, Hamas militants, but, civilians get caught in the crossfire, and that's unfortunate, but it's a part of war. But when you're killing 20 to 1 civilians to Hamas members, how is anybody supposed to come away with any other conclusion than you are intentionally targeting these civilians? And I don't know how anybody could possibly come away with that, any other conclusion, especially given what we've heard from Israeli politicians, calling Palestinians human animals. You know, one of the top Israeli military members openly saying at the start of this campaign, our goal is on, damage and destruction, not accuracy. You know, when Benjamin Netanyahu comes out and he references the biblical story of Amalek, where in that story, the Israelis, or the offensive side in this equation, goes and completely obliterates Amalek and destroys everybody, man, woman, child, ox, cattle. That's how the Bible verse goes, right? So, I mean, when you have openly genocidal language like that, when you downplay even the existence of Palestinian civilians, and when this is what you're doing on the ground, I don't know how you could possibly come away with any other conclusion than this is an ethnic cleansing. This is an intentional genocidal campaign that Israel is waging right now. I mean, it's a ratio of over 90% civilians. 90%. I mean, and people still make the argument of like, oh, well, they're just human shields. Really? They're just human shields. 90%. You're killing 20 to 1, and that's still human shields. You're bombing like maternity wards and cancer wards of hospitals, and those cancer wards were just human shields, right? I mean, it's so patently absurd, right? UN shelters, mosques, churches, schools, refugee camps, all of that. Oh, they're all just human shields. I mean, how stupid and gullible do you have to believe to buy into that narrative? We also have here from Jordan. Israel is on pace to kill more women and children in Gaza in just a few months than the U.S. did in Afghanistan in 20 years. In 20 years, okay? I mean, again, just to give you a perspective of the scale of all of this that is happening right now, this was another helpful graph here. Deaths reported in Gaza. And look at how much. So the orange is women and children, right? Which obviously doesn't include innocent men, because, obviously when we talk about this, women and children is a good sort of benchmark for people in their minds to understand, like, okay, women and children, those are obviously innocent civilians, right? You should include men in that equation, in my opinion, at least, because there are plenty of innocent men who aren't Hamas militants, who didn't attack Israel on October 7th. They have nothing to do with this. They're just innocent, random bystanders who have, honestly been showing incredible amounts of bravery and going out and pulling people from the rubble and trying to rescue people and all that good stuff. So, but I mean, this is just women and children. Look at how much of that compared to the all people benchmark here up top. So, I mean, it's a massive bulk. In fact, it's the vast majority of people that Israel is killing are innocent women and children. And then if you throw men in that equation, innocent men, I mean, it would be, again, it's over 90%. So, I mean, it's not even up in the air at this point, right? And when you get a comparison like this with an absolutely disastrous war like Afghanistan that the U.S. waged for 2 decades, and Israel has engaged in more carnage, more deaths of civilians in just a couple of months than the U.S. did in 20 years in Afghanistan. I mean, it's like totally unprecedented in modern history, in the modern history of warfare, okay? I've seen other comparisons to Iraq as well. I mean, more dead kids, more dead innocent people than in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, okay? In the entire year of 2003 when we went into Iraq and destroyed this country as well. So, I mean, I don't know, again, I don't know how people make arguments that this is just self-defense. It is very clearly not self-defense. And, there's also the comparison that I frequently use on this channel that many other people use as well, which is that of Ukraine, right? We're kind of lucky in a sense that Ukraine happened under the Biden administration. And so we have a direct comparison with how U.S. politicians talk about Ukraine versus how U.S. politicians talk about Israel. We had a guy like John Kirby who literally got up on the podium and was crying, literally crying. I'm not exaggerating. He got up and he cried in front of the world for Ukrainian civilians that were being killed. And now we have a death toll of Palestinian civilians who are being killed on a scale that is not even remotely comparable to what has happened in Ukraine in a much shorter time scale. And they basically just go up there and they make excuses. And they say, we are partners with Israel. We stand with Israel. They're engaging in self-defense against brutal terrorism and all of that stuff, right? So, I mean, just the hypocrisy there is so glaring that people all around the world are obviously going to notice this. And they are obviously going to call out the United States on our brazen hypocrisy. And people, I think, are coming to the realization, especially a lot of young people who tend to be more pro-Palestinian, who are following this right now, they come to the realization of like, oh shit, all of this preaching about human rights and freedom and democracy and all of that stuff is utter and complete bullshit. And the United States doesn't actually care about, human rights or freedom or democracy. What we actually care is that, you are a partner to us. You are a geopolitical ally for us. You are going to do our bidding on the world stage. You are economically beneficial to us, right? You are politically beneficial to us. I mean, that's how this shit works, okay? And you can look at Ukraine as an example. When Russia invaded Ukraine back in February of 2022, you look at the time scale that has passed. We're now in November of 2023, right? So we're talking about a year and a half, roughly, of warfare inside Ukraine that has been incredibly brutal, right? Thousands and thousands of people have died. But if you look at these civilian casualties, right? Now, keep in mind, the Biden administration, every single member of the Biden administration called, Putin a war criminal for the most part, right? Some of them even said he's engaging in like a genocidal campaign against the Ukrainian people, okay? And they called him out on all of those crimes and everything. In a year and a half of warfare in Ukraine, Russia killed roughly 500 or so children in a year and a half. And Israel has killed now over 8,000 children in Gaza in just under 2 months. So, I mean, again, the scale and the speed of the death and destruction is totally unprecedented. We also have this from True to Parsi. Israel has killed more than 20,000 Palestinians. 1,000 to 2,000 have been Hamas fighters. Again, 90 to 95% of those that have been killed have been innocent civilians. And the US and Europe call this self-defense. We also had this, again, on the journalist side of this, from the Washington Post, an investigation by a French organization, Reporters Without Borders, into the killing in October of a Reuters cameraman, Issam Abdullah, concluded that Abdullah and his co-workers, several of whom were injured, were explicitly targeted. So here you have the Washington Post admitting not only is Israel killing a massive amount of journalists, dozens of journalists, in order to silence them, in order to prevent them from covering what is happening on the ground right now, but they're explicitly targeting them, okay? It's not an accident. You weren't targeting Hamas and then oopsie daisy, you accidentally hit a journalist who was on the ground covering it. No, they're going after them. They're going after their families, okay? Keep in mind, this Reuters cameraman, this journalist who works for Reuters, who was killed at the time when Reuters covered this, they used neutral language. Even Reuters themselves, the people who were employing this man who was slaughtered by Israel intentionally, even they could not come out and use active language to describe what Israel had done. They used neutral terms like, oh, there was a blast that went off. There was an explosion. There was a rocket. Who knows where it came from? It fell from the sky. I don't know. Somebody died. Unfortunate. I mean, it is so disgusting and pathetic from Western media sources to not see this for what it is. Again, here from Ryan Grimm. So here's the scoop from Politico. The U.S. has sent the coordinates of aid organizations on the ground in Gaza to Israel to help prevent strikes. Want to guess what they did with that information? They say despite that effort, despite is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, many humanitarian sites have been bombarded. So translated here from Ryan Grimm, the U.S. sent coordinates of aid organizations in Gaza to Israel, and Israel proceeded to bomb them. They proceeded to target them. So this is our great ally, right? The only democracy in the Middle East, right? This is our ally that we are sending weapons to. We tell them the coordinates of aid organizations to say, hey, don't target these people. We know where they are. That's a safe zone. That's not Hamas. That's an aid organization. And Israel takes that information and they turn around and they say, we're going to bomb the shit out of those aid organizations. That's what they say. So, I mean, there you go. We also have this in terms of the future of this truce, I guess, if you want to call it that, a pause in the bombing in terms of what the future holds for Gaza. Here from Jeremy Scahill, an Israeli defense minister, says that after the truce, quote, the enemy will meet first the bombs of the Air Force, and after that the shells of the tanks, and the artillery, and the scoops of the D9 bulldozers, and finally gunfire of the infantry troops. We will fight in the entire strip. The entire strip. Also here, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, okay, he says this will be a short respite, after which the fighting will continue with intensity, and pressure will be made to bring back more hostages. At least 2 more months of fighting is expected. At least 2 more months of fighting is expected. Now keep in mind, we're talking about militaries. Militaries tend to underestimate how long some sort of an operation like this is going to actually be successful, or how long it's going to take to be successful in their eyes. So when he says 2 months, what are we really talking about here? 3 months, 4 months, a year? I mean, seriously. He says at least 2 months of fighting is expected. So this humanitarian pause, if you want to call it that, I think it's kind of a joke to call it that, but this pause in the fighting, while it's good in the sense that Palestinian hostages were freed Israeli hostages were freed. They get to go back to their family members. That's fantastic. That is actually good news in a sea of absolutely horrific carnage, right? That is good news. But it is not anything to look at in terms of this being some sort of a long-term solution. It's not a long-term solution. It's not even a short-term solution. So we'll see how long this temporary pause lasts. As far as I know, it's still in effect right now, even though Israel is bombing Syria and they're bombing Lebanon and they're doing raids and killing Palestinians in the West Bank. I saw one headline just the other day, 8 Palestinians killed in a raid in the West Bank. So even though Israel is doing all of that bullshit, it still seems like it's mostly intact in Gaza. Now, the humanitarian situation is obviously still horrific in Gaza. It doesn't look like it's going to necessarily get back to, even what it was before this invasion by Israel, this bombing campaign by Israel, which even what it was before was still pretty fucking horrific, right? I mean, we're talking about the world's largest open-air prison here, where conditions were absolutely abysmal. So, I mean, listen, in the long-term sense, I don't know where this goes from here. I mean, Israel can continue to bomb, they can continue to invade, they can continue to slaughter innocent men, women, and children and bomb mosques and schools and UN shelters and refugee camps and all of that. They can continue to do that, but what is this going to produce in the long term other than just abject death and destruction? It's not going to produce anything. It's certainly not going to produce peace in the long term. If anything, this has a much higher chance of spiraling towards a broader conflict in the region that could even potentially involve the United States. So, obviously it's not great news. It's good news in the short term because people were released and back to their families and all of that good stuff. But this certainly is not going to get better from here. It's, in the words of the defense minister of Israel, it's going to get much more intense and much worse from here. And in the meantime, again, in terms of Joe Biden's complicity here, Genocide Joe moves to lift every restriction, nearly every restriction, on Israel's access to U.S. weapons stockpile. So there you go. Now the Joe Biden administration is turning around and panicking and wondering why Arab Americans, why young Americans, why anybody with a moral spine whatsoever is thinking about potentially not voting for this guy in 2024. And that's a whole nother conversation in terms of how frustrating it is to see people who look at what Joe Biden is doing right now and they see the backlash to it and they see people who say, I'm not going to vote for this motherfucker. And they turn around and they say, well, but Trump's worse. Yeah, Trump is worse on this issue, on many issues, if not basically every issue. But when you are funding and arming and giving diplomatic cover for and lying for a genocidal campaign, against a group of people that people care about, then don't expect to have their votes. I mean, it's really fucking that simple. I don't tell people who to vote for, but listen. This is who Joe Biden is. We've known that this is who Joe Biden is. He's been the same guy for decades and decades and decades. So you wouldn't expect much back from him. But at the same time, again, on the political front, don't expect people to support you unless you are going to radically change your policy and end the bloodshed and end the violence that one of our closest allies in the entire world, if not our single closest ally in the entire world, unless they put a fucking end to this and actually engage in some sort of a long-term plan for justice for Palestinians.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying